The ballroom smelled like champagne and old money, and Vanessa Cole's laugh cut through it like a blade wrapped in silk. "I'm serious," she said, leaning into her friend's shoulder, her wineglass tilting dangerously in her manicured hand. "Renee does something with computers for the Navy. IT support, I think. Or maybe cyber. Whatever. She never really explains it, and honestly, I've stopped asking." Her friend laughed politely, the kind of laugh people give when they don't actually find something funny, but want to seem included. I was 3 tables away, close enough to hear every syllable, and Vanessa knew it. She always knew exactly how far her voice would carry. I didn't turn around. I picked up my water glass instead and took a slow sip, letting the cold settle the heat that wanted to rise in my chest. 27 years in this uniform, and some things never stopped stinging, not because they were true, because they were said with such confidence that truth stopped mattering. At the podium, a woman in Navy service dress whites tapped the microphone twice. Lieutenant Sarah Byrne, the evening's mistress of ceremonies, had a voice built for exactly this kind of room, warm, clear, and impossible to talk over. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention," she said. "Tonight, the Navy League is honoring an officer whose work has quietly reshaped how this nation defends itself in a battle space most of you have never heard of, and most of you will never see." Vanessa didn't even look up from her phone. "Please stand, and please join me in welcoming, for a very special recognition tonight, Rear Admiral Renee Holt." I watched Vanessa's wineglass freeze halfway to her lips. I stood up. Her head turned slow and disbelieving from the stage to the empty chair I'd just left and then to me, walking toward the podium in my dress blues with the 2 silver stars still pinned to my shoulder boards, stars that in about 40 minutes were going to become 3. She didn't know that part yet. Neither did my father. I want to tell you, before we go any further, that I didn't plan this evening as revenge. I want that to be clear, because it would be easy to tell this story as one long, satisfying act of payback, and for a while, some small, tired part of me might have wanted exactly that. But that isn't really what this is. This is a story about what happens when you finally stop asking people to see you, and simply let the truth stand in the room on its own. My name is Renee Holt. I'm 49 years old, and I've spent 27 of those years in the United States Navy, most of them in a world that doesn't officially exist on any organizational chart you'll ever be shown. I enlisted at 19 straight out of a 2-year stint that got me nowhere and taught me everything, and worked my way through the Naval Academy's officer commissioning program a few years behind my peers, which meant I'd already learned how to be underestimated long before I ever put on a uniform. By the time most of my academy classmates made captain, I'd already spent a decade building a specialty most people had never heard of and couldn't have explained if their careers depended on it. That gap between what I actually did and what anyone in my family believed I did is where this whole story lives. To understand how we got to this ballroom, you have to go back 2 weeks to a backyard in Virginia that smelled like charcoal and old resentments. My father, Walter Holt, believed there were 2 kinds of people in this world: the ones who served and the ones who talked about serving. He'd spent 30 years as an Army Master Sergeant, 2 combat tours in his younger years, and a long career training new recruits after that, and even 15 years into retirement, he still stood like a man expecting an inspection. He ironed his golf shirts. He called it field discipline when my mother, before she passed, used to tease him about it. I loved him. That's the part people sometimes forget when I tell this story, that this isn't a story about hating my father. It's a story about a man who understood exactly one shape that service could take because it was the shape that had defined his own life, and who had never quite made room in his head for the possibility that it could take another. The barbecue was for my brother Derek, who'd just been promoted to regional sales director at a mid-sized logistics company. To hear my father tell it, you'd have thought Derek had been given a battlefield commission. "Regional director," Dad said for the 3rd time that hour, clapping Derek on the back hard enough to slosh his beer. "You know how many people report to him now? 40. 40. That's not nothing, that's a whole command." "Dad, it's really not that big a deal," Derek said in the exact tone people use when they mean the opposite. "It's a big deal," Dad said. "It's leadership. It's real responsibility. Not everybody's cut out for it." Someone had brought a cheap bag of charcoal instead of the good lump kind, and the smoke hung low and acrid over the yard, mixing with the smell of my father's pride, which was, if anything, even thicker. I stood near the cooler, nursing a water bottle, watching a scene I'd watched play out in a dozen variations since I was a teenager. Standing beside Derek, glowing in a way that had nothing to do with the summer heat, was Vanessa. She was a junior partner track associate at a downtown law firm, and she wore her ambition the way other people wore perfume. You could smell it from across the yard. "Renee," she said, turning her megawatt smile toward me like she just remembered I existed. "Still doing your Navy thing?" "Still doing my Navy thing," I said. "Cyber, right? Is that like IT?" She said it the way you'd ask a child if they still played with dolls. "Something like that," I said. There was no version of the truth I could give her in a backyard with a beer in my hand. Not because it was classified, though most of it was, but because there was no framework in her head to receive it. "Well, listen," Vanessa said, looping her arm through Derek's. "We're having our real engagement party in 2 weeks at the Marchbanks Club downtown. Very exclusive, very small guest list." She paused, like she was doing me a favor by even mentioning it. "You should come if you can get away from whatever it is you do." I didn't need to check my phone, I already knew the date. "I can't," I said. "I have a mandatory work function that night." Vanessa actually laughed out loud, a bright, incredulous sound. "A work function? For the Navy?" She turned back to Derek. "It's fine, we'll just get her a gift." "It's a Navy League gala, actually," I said, keeping my voice light. "It's a fairly significant event for my department." Sure, Vanessa said, already scrolling through something on her phone, her attention gone the way a light switches off. "I just think it's funny is all. Derek's out here closing 7-figure accounts and you got a gala for." Dottie, what? The Facebook page? "No offense, I actually think it's sweet. You're still doing it after all these years. Very wholesome." My father hadn't said a word this whole exchange. He was studying his beer bottle like it owed him money. "Dad," I said, half a joke, half a test, "you're awfully quiet." He looked up. "You made Admiral, right?" "Somebody told me that. Rear Admiral or something. Your Aunt Carol mentioned it at Christmas, I think. Or maybe it was the dentist. I don't remember." 2 years ago, I said. 2 silver stars. "Right. Yeah." He nodded slowly, the way you nodded a fact you filed away but never actually opened. I never really understood what that means, though. Like, what do you do exactly? Sit in an office? Push paper? He wasn't being cruel. That was the strange, exhausting thing about it. His tone was almost curious, almost kind, and somehow that made it worse. I mean, I get it. It's a big rank. I just don't get what it's for. There it was. Not malice. Not even dismissiveness exactly, just absence. A door he'd never bothered to walk through in 27 years, even though I'd left it unlocked the whole time, waiting. "It's complicated to explain at a barbecue," I said. "A lot of it I can't get into anyway." Right. Secret stuff." He said it the way you'd humor a child's imaginary friend. "Well, somebody's got to do the desk jobs, keeps the real operators free to do their thing." I didn't correct him. I'd tried correcting him 100 times over the years, and it never landed anywhere. It just slid off, like water off a windshield that had been treated to repel exactly this kind of thing. "Something like that," I said again, and reached for the potato salad. Vanessa's laugh followed me all the way to the drink cooler. I drove home that night with the windows down, letting the summer air do the work my temper wanted to do instead. This was the same old song, and I knew all its verses by heart. My master's degree in applied mathematics, the 18 months I'd spent earning it while deployed, had been filed away as nice. My advanced strategic command qualification, a brutal 6-month review process that had broken officers twice my size, had earned a pat on the head and a question about whether I'd seen the bonus Derek got for hitting his quarterly numbers. It wasn't that my family was cruel. If you'd asked any of them, they would have told you, honestly, that they loved me. And they did, in their way. The trouble was that their picture of me had been painted when I was 15 years old and hadn't made the varsity soccer team, and somewhere in the decades since, they'd simply stopped updating the canvas. Every new fact about my life, the commission, the deployments, the doctorate-level coursework, the stars, got filed into the same old frame, Renee, the quiet one. Renee, who never quite lived up to Derek. Renee, who did something with computers. They needed me to stay small, I think. Though none of them would ever have put it that way, it made the family math simpler. Derek was the ambitious one, the shark, the one who was going places. If I was allowed to be extraordinary too, the whole story they'd been telling themselves for 30 years would need rewriting, and nobody in that backyard was in the market for a rewrite. That night, I called Admiral James Callahan. He'd been my mentor since I was a 22-year-old ensign who couldn't yet spell cryptology, and now, 4 stars and 2 years into retirement, he still picked up on the second ring whenever I called. "You sound tired," he said. "No hello." "I am tired. My family thinks I do IT support." He laughed, a low, rumbling sound. "Renee, your family thinks a lot of things. Doesn't mean they're right." "Tomorrow's the frocking ceremony," I said. 3 stars, 27 years, and it still doesn't feel real. "It's real," Callahan said, his voice softening. "You earned every inch of that 3rd star. Signals intelligence doctrine you helped write is going to be taught at the academy for the next 20 years. Whatever your father thinks you do, that's his limitation, not your legacy." "I know," I said. And I did know it, in the part of my brain that processed intelligence reports and made command decisions. It was the other part, the part that was still 15 and hadn't made varsity, that needed to hear it out loud sometimes. "You remember when I recruited you into the cryptology program?" Callahan asked. "Your father called me, did you know that? About 6 months in. He never told me that." "He wanted to know if there was a real track you could transfer to. Combat arms, something with a rifle in it. I told him the work you were doing would matter more to this country's security than anything I did in 31 years of active service. And he laughed at me, politely. But he laughed. I sat with that for a moment, something tightening in my throat. "You never told me that either. Didn't need to. You didn't need one more reason to feel like you were disappointing him. You needed to become who you were going to become, which you did, spectacularly, without his permission." A pause. "One more thing," Callahan said, before we hung up. "Whatever happens tomorrow night, however they react, don't let it close you off. You've built a life of extraordinary purpose. Don't let their smallness make you small too." I didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. The next morning, I was in my office at Fort Meade when Petty Officer Priya Anand knocked on my open door, holding a stack of printouts like they might bite her. "Ma'am, I finished the threat assessment brief, I think. I hope." "Sit," I said, gesturing to the chair across from my desk. She sat like she was bracing for impact. I read through her work. It was good, sharp, well-organized, a little overcautious in her conclusions, the way smart junior analysts often are before they trust their own judgment. "This is solid," I said. "Your instincts on the network anomaly are correct. Say it with more confidence next time." Priya exhaled like she'd been holding her breath since she walked in. "My dad still asks me when I'm going to get a real job," she said, half laughing, half not. "He was in the army. Infantry. He doesn't really—" She gestured vaguely at the SIF door down the hall. "Get this. He came to visit last month and I couldn't even tell him what building I worked in most days. Just, support. That's the word I use. Support." "Welcome to the club," I said. "You keep doing the work. Eventually the work speaks for itself. Sometimes it takes longer than you'd like. Sometimes it takes longer than feels fair." "Did it, for you?" she asked, and then seemed to catch herself, embarrassed by the directness of the question. "Sorry, ma'am, that's probably not." "No, it's a fair question." I set the printout down and considered how much to say. I spent a long time thinking, if I just explained it better, or waited for the right rank, or the right moment, someone in my family would finally understand what I do and why it matters. I'm not sure that's ever really going to happen, honestly. Some people don't have the frame of reference to receive it, no matter how clearly you explain it. That doesn't mean the work isn't real. It just means you eventually have to stop measuring it by whether they clap. Priya was quiet for a second, turning that over. "That's kind of bleak, ma'am. No offense." "Fair." "I'd say it's more freeing than bleak. Once you sit with it a while, you get to stop performing your worth for an audience that was never going to give you a fair review anyway." I slid the printout back across the desk to her. "Fix the formatting on page 3, tighten your executive summary, and send it back to me by 1500. This is good work, Petty Officer. Start believing that on your own, before anyone else tells you to." She nodded, and something in her shoulders nodded a fraction. I recognized it because I'd felt it myself 100 times in 100 rooms where my competence was invisible to the people who loved me most. The sensitive compartmented information facility had no windows. It didn't need them. The only light came from monitor glow and a row of digital clocks on the far wall. Zulu, DC. Pearl Harbor, Manama. marking time and places most people would never think about before their coffee got cold. The air inside was cool and recycled, faintly metallic, the particular silence of a room built to keep secrets rather than comfort the people who worked inside it. I'd spent more hours of my adult life in rooms like this one than in my own living room, and there were mornings I felt more at home under its fluorescent hum than I did anywhere else on Earth. There's a version of this job that television gets right, and a version it gets almost entirely wrong. It gets the tension right, the sense that decisions made in rooms like this one ripple outward into consequences most of the country will never trace back to their source. What it gets wrong is the noise. Real crisis response isn't shouting and slammed doors. It's quiet, it's people who have trained for years to keep their voices level exactly when the stakes are highest, because panic is contagious and precision isn't. Lieutenant Commander Naomi Okafor, call sign Owl because she saw things before anyone else did, stepped into my office without knocking. She never knocked. In 11 years of service together, she'd learned that if the door was open, I expected to be interrupted. "Ma'am," she said, voice pitched low even though we were alone. "Cedric in traffic just updated. There's unusual positioning from a 7th Fleet contact zone. O&E flagged it an hour ago. My pulse didn't spike. It just engaged, like a gear catching. Walk with me," I said. In the VTC suite, I sat at the head of a long table, my reflection faint in the polished surface, while screens around the room filled with the faces of captains and fellow flag officers scattered across 3 time zones. "Here's what we have," I said, and the room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the person speaking has spent decades earning that silence. "Recommend we authorize release of this SIGINT package to Compafel immediately. My assessment is that task force positioning should be reviewed at the fleet commander level. This is time sensitive, but the operational call belongs with them, not with me." Someone on the Pearl Harbor screen nodded. "Copy, Admiral. Passing to fleet now." "Owl, get me a secure line to the CNO's office," I added. "They'll want the full assessment before the morning brief." "On it, ma'am." The room moved with the quiet, terrifying efficiency of people who had trained for exactly this moment for years and hoped every single day that they'd never have to use it. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody needed to. That was the strange truth about the highest stakes rooms I ever sat in. They were the quietest rooms I knew. That was the job. Not commanding ships myself. I'd never claimed that authority, and I'd have corrected anyone who assumed it. My job was to see the pattern in the noise before anyone else did, and to make sure the people with the authority to act had what they needed, fast enough to matter. It was a strange kind of power, invisible, distributed, and entirely dependent on trust built over years, never on a title alone. By the time the VTC ended, it was almost 11 at night. Naomi walked with me back toward my office, her tablet tucked under one arm. "You good, ma'am?" she asked. It was the question she always asked after a long one, and I always answered the same way. "I'm good. You should get some sleep, Owl." "Yes, ma'am. Congratulations again, by the way. On tomorrow." She hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, ma'am, I've served under a lot of officers. I've never worked for anyone who deserved a moment like tomorrow more than you do." "Thank you, Naomi. That means more than you know." While I sat in that room, weighing variables that could shift the security posture of an entire ocean, my phone buzzed on the table. A text from Vanessa, just confirming. "Table settings are ivory, not white. Don't wear anything that clashes, LELL." I didn't respond. I didn't have the bandwidth to explain that I was, at that exact moment, more concerned with a miscalculation in the South Pacific than with the color of a tablecloth. That was the whole of it, really. The duality. At home, my opinion on where to eat dinner got overruled by my brother's confidence. In this room, my signature moved intelligence that shaped decisions worth billions of dollars and thousands of lives. My family only respected power they could photograph, a corner office, a law firm letterhead. They had no framework for a woman whose authority lived behind a badge that said "Talk Scret, /" and they'd never once asked me to explain it to them. That afternoon, Lieutenant Sarah Byrne appeared at my office door with a folder and an expression I couldn't quite read. "Ma'am, do you have a minute?" "Public affairs business." "Always for you, Sarah. Sit." "The Senate confirmed your promotion this morning," she said, and even though I'd known it was coming, hearing it said out loud landed somewhere in my chest I wasn't expecting. "Frocking ceremony is tomorrow night at the Navy League Gala." Secretary of the Navy, will officiate personally. It's a significant honor, ma'am. They don't usually do this for flag officers outside the Pentagon. Thank you, Sarah. She hesitated. Can I say something? Off the record? Go ahead. I've read your file, Neptune's Spearhead, the Doctrine Rewrite, the Interagency Work with O&I. I've been in public affairs 8 years, and I don't think I've prepared a bio this impressive that so few people outside this building have ever heard of. She paused. I noticed in your emergency contact information that your family's civilian addresses are local. Have they been notified? Sometimes families like to attend. They'll be there, I said. I invited them myself, just not with details. Sarah nodded slowly, professional curiosity giving way to something gentler. For what it's worth, the rank announcement isn't embargoed because of secrecy around your family, if that's what's on your mind. Flag officer promotions are held for public release until the ceremony as standard protocol for every officer every time. It's not personal. It was never about keeping them out. I hadn't realized how much I needed to hear that until she said it, because some small tired part of me had wondered more than once whether I'd use the secrecy of the work as an excuse, whether some part of me had wanted them to stay in the dark, because the dark was easier than another disappointing conversation about my little computer job. Thank you, I said again, and meant it differently this time. Can I ask you something, ma'am? Sarah said, gathering her folder but not quite standing yet. Off the record, again. Go ahead. Why haven't you told them? Not the classified parts, obviously not those. Just the rank, the title. It would take about 4 words. I turned the question over for a moment because I'd asked it of myself more than once and never quite landed on an answer I fully trusted. Partly because for years the silence was easier than another conversation that went nowhere, I said finally. You get tired of handing someone the same piece of information over and watching them set it down in the same spot every time, like it never happened. Eventually, you stop handing it over at all. It's not really about secrecy, it's about self-preservation. I paused. But if I'm honest, I think some part of me also wanted them to find out this way. All at once. Somewhere they couldn't look away or change the subject. I'm not entirely proud of that, but it's true. Sarah nodded slowly without judgment. For what it's worth, ma'am, I don't think that makes you petty. I think it makes you human. There's a difference between wanting to be seen and wanting revenge, even if they look similar from a distance. I hope you're right, Sarah. I usually am, ma'am. It's why they pay me to write your talking points. She smiled, professional again, and let herself out. The final call from Vanessa came that evening while I was reviewing readiness reports at my kitchen table. Hey, quick thing, she said, breezy as ever. Derek and I were talking and, no offense, Renee, we love that you're doing your patriotic thing, but maybe you shouldn't wear your uniform to the actual wedding? It might be a little much. It's kind of a whole military costume vibe, you know? We want people focused on us, not on, like, a computer game dressed up as service. A computer game dressed up as service. I sat very still for a moment, phone against my ear, and felt something inside me settle. Not flare up, not break, just settle, like sediment finding the bottom of a glass. You still there? Vanessa asked, a little impatient, the way you'd nudge a call center rep who'd gone quiet mid-transaction. I'm here, I said. So, we're good? On the uniform thing? I could have told her right then. I could have said the words out loud. Vanessa, I outrank nearly every officer you will ever meet in your life. And tomorrow night, the Secretary of the Navy is pinning a 3rd star to my shoulder in front of 300 people, and watch 2 decades of condescension collapse in real time over a kitchen table and a phone line. Some small, tired part of me wanted exactly that, wanted it badly enough that my hand tightened around my coffee mug. But that wasn't the correction this moment called for. A phone call wasn't big enough to hold what I needed her and my father and my brother to finally understand. Words had never worked on them. 20 years of words had never once worked on them. This needed a room. It needed witnesses. It needed the kind of proof that didn't leave any room for a joke, an eye roll, a quick change of subject. Understood, I said, my voice even. Giving her nothing. I have to go, Vanessa. Early morning, I hung up before she could say anything else. 20 years of small comments like sand in a shoe, 20 years of correcting the record, gently, patiently, and watching the corrections slide off like water off glass. I wasn't angry. That was the strange part. What I felt was colder than anger and clearer. This wasn't a moment for another conversation. Conversations hadn't worked in 2 decades. This was a moment for the truth to simply become visible, all at once, in a room too public to argue with. I picked up the phone and called my brother. It rang 3 times before he answered, background noise suggesting he was somewhere loud, a bar maybe, or a crowded restaurant, the ordinary texture of a life that had never once had to account for a stiff silence. Hey Ren, what's up? Kind of in the middle of something. Derek, I said, letting the old, small, apologetic version of my voice settle over the words, the version they'd always expected from me. I'm really sorry I can't make the engagement party. This work dinner tomorrow is mandatory, and it's actually a pretty big honor for my department. Sure, Derek said, distracted, the clink of glassware audible somewhere behind him. Vanessa mentioned, it's fine, honestly, don't stress about it. I almost let it go there. It would have been easy. The path of least resistance I'd walked 100 times before, the one where I quietly absorbed the slight and moved on. But something in me, cold and precise now instead of hurt, wanted them in that room. Actually, I said, I have a table. Would you, Dad, and Vanessa like to come as my guests? I'd really love for you to be there. It matters to me. There was a pause, the sound of him weighing whether this was worth the effort against whatever he'd rather be doing with his evening. Yeah, okay. Might be nice to see what you do for once. Free dinner, right? It would mean a lot, I said, and I let them hear only the small Renee, the quiet one, the one they thought they knew. The one who was asking a favor instead of extending an invitation to witness the truth of her entire life. I'll have the ticket sent over. Formal dress if you have it. Copy that, Admiral, Derek said, laughing at his own joke, no idea yet how literally true it was about to become. See you tomorrow. I hung up and sat for a long moment in the quiet of my kitchen, phone still warm in my hand, feeling something between guilt and resolve settle over me in equal measure. I hadn't lied to him. I'd simply let his assumptions do what they always did, fill in the blanks with the smallest possible version of me and walk confidently forward on that foundation, straight into a room that was about to prove them wrong. Admiral Callahan called me one last time before I left for the gala. Nervous? He asked. A little. Good. Means it still matters to you. A pause. Renee, listen to me. Whatever happens in that room tonight, however your family reacts, however long it takes, or doesn't, I need you to remember something. You didn't build this career to prove them wrong. You built it because you were called to it. The recognition tonight is real and it's earned, and you should let yourself feel every second of it. But don't let their applause or their silence become the thing your worth depends on. That part was always yours. I hear you, I said quietly. Good, now go put on that 3rd star. You've made the whole community proud, Admiral. I stood in front of the mirror in my quarters an hour before the car arrived, running my thumb over the 2 silver stars still pinned in place. The space between them and my collar, where a 3rd would sit by the end of the night. My dress blues hung the way they'd hung for 100 formal events before this one, and yet my hands weren't entirely steady as I fastened the last button. I thought about the 15-year-old who hadn't made varsity, standing in a different mirror in a different house, telling herself that the ache of not being chosen would go away eventually if she just worked hard enough at something else. I thought about the Ensign, fresh out of the academy, sitting through her first family Christmas in uniform, listening to her father explain to a neighbor what her brother did for a living in loving, exhaustive detail, and then summarizing her own career in 4 words, she's in the Navy. I thought about every promotion board, every deployment, every 3 a.m. call to a SIF on a holiday while the rest of my family slept soundly, certain that whatever I was doing couldn't possibly be as important as it would turn out to be. None of that anger lived in me anymore, not really. What replaced it, standing in that mirror, was something more like clarity, the simple, settled knowledge that I had built an entire life of consequence out of rooms nobody in my family had ever bothered to look inside. Tonight, for one evening, the door to that room was finally going to open in front of them, whether they were ready to walk through it or not. I straightened my collar one last time, picked up my cover, and went to meet the car. My family arrived at the Navy League Gala, looking like exactly what they were. 3 well-dressed civilians who had no idea they'd walked into the middle of my life's work. Vanessa had brought a +1 of her own, a friend from the ballroom crowd she'd been gossiping with, cleared in advance through the RSVP list Sarah Byrne had quietly confirmed for me that morning. My father wore his one good suit, the same one from Derek's college graduation, and kept glancing at the uniforms around the room with the wary respect of a man who recognized rank insignia but not names. "There sure are a lot of admirals here," he murmured to Derek, adjusting his tie. "I count at least 6 stars just at that one table." "It's a Navy thing, Dad," Derek said, already checking his phone under the table. "Renee's people, I guess." Vanessa was mid-story to her friend, gesturing with her wineglass, not even glancing at the stage. "Anyway," she was saying, "so I told the partner, if you want this deal closed by Friday, you're going to have to trust my read on the counterparty because I've done this a dozen times." I sat 2 tables over, near the front, my hands folded in my lap, watching them, not watch me. There was a strange calm in it. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't performing smallness for their benefit. I was simply waiting, the way I'd waited through years of holidays and dinners and half-heard congratulations. Except this time, the waiting had an ending I already knew, and they didn't. A server refilled water glasses around the room. Somewhere near the back, a string quartet finished a piece and shifted into something quieter, a cue that dinner service was winding down and the formal program was about to begin. My father straightened in his chair, the old instinct of a man who'd spent 30 years responding to formation calls even when he was the only one who noticed them. Admiral Callahan found me at my table a few minutes before the program began, resplendent in a suit that still somehow managed to look like a uniform, 4 decades of bearing impossible to fully retire. "You look terrified," he said, taking the seat beside me. "I look composed. There's a difference. You look terrified in a very composed way then." He glanced across the room, following my line of sight to the table where my father sat, still counting stars on strangers' shoulders. "That them?" "That's them." "Ugh, your father still doesn't know, does he?" "Not a clue." Callahan shook his head slowly, something between amusement and old, familiar frustration crossing his face. 30 years in that uniform, and the man still can't recognize what real service looks like unless it's wearing his particular shape. "I've seen it before, Renee. More times than I'd like." He patted my hand once, briefly. The closest thing to physical affection I'd ever seen out of him in public. "Whatever happens at that table in 20 minutes, remember what I told you. You didn't build this for them. You get to enjoy it regardless of how they take it." "I know," I said, and for the first time all week, I actually believed it. Lieutenant Sarah Byrne stepped up to the podium. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. Before we move to dinner, we have a special ceremony to conduct. Tonight we are frocking an officer whose 2 decades of work in signals intelligence and cyber warfare doctrine has fundamentally reshaped how this Navy protects the nation in a battle space most people will never see. I'll ask the Secretary of the Navy to join me at the podium." The Secretary stepped up and the room settled into the particular hush that precedes something important. "Tonight," the Secretary began, "we recognize Rear Admiral Renee Holt, whose leadership on what is known internally as Operation Neptune Spearhead has become the foundation of modern naval cyber doctrine. Admiral Holt, would you please join us?" My father's head turned toward the stage, then toward my empty chair, then back, slow confusion spreading across his face. I stood, smoothed my jacket, and walked to the front of the room. "Ha!" The applause started before I even reached the stage. Not polite applause, but a full, rising wave of it, officers of every branch coming to their feet in a wall of sound. I saw Vanessa's face lose every ounce of color. Her wineglass trembled in her hand. Her eyes went from the stage to my empty chair to me and back again, like she was trying to make the math add up and couldn't. The Secretary took a small case from an aide and opened it to reveal a 3rd silver star. "Admiral Holt has been confirmed by the United States Senate for promotion to the rank of Vice Admiral," he said, and the room erupted again. He pinned the star to my left shoulder board himself, and then the Chief of Naval Operations stepped forward and pinned the right, the old naval tradition of 2 senior officers frocking one of their own. I felt the small, precise weight of it settle onto my shoulder, 27 years compressed into an ounce of silver. I stood there in front of 300 people who understood instantly and completely exactly what this moment meant, while 3 feet away, at the edge of my vision, my own family sat frozen, understanding nothing at all. And then slowly understanding everything. My father stood up so fast his chair scraped backward against the floor, the sound sharp enough to cut through the applause. He didn't salute. Some old instinct in him seemed to know that wasn't the moment, wasn't the place. A rule so old in his bones he obeyed it even in shock. But his hand came halfway up to his chest anyway. An old soldier's reflex, he caught and pressed flat against his sternum instead. As if he were trying to hold something in. His face had gone through 3 expressions in as many seconds: confusion, then disbelief, then something I had never once seen there in 50 years of being his daughter. It looked almost like grief. I understood, watching him, that it probably was grief for 30 years of conversations he could have had and hadn't, dawning on him all at once, under the worst possible lighting, in front of 300 strangers. I hadn't expected to feel my own throat tighten watching that. I had pictured this moment countless times, and in every version I had imagined my own vindication. I hadn't pictured his. Derek's jaw had gone slack. He reached up and tugged at his collar, like it had suddenly gotten too tight, glancing sideways at Vanessa as if she might explain what he was looking at. Vanessa didn't move at all. She sat rigid, the color drained entirely from her face, her wineglass forgotten in her hand, tilting dangerously until her friend gently reached over and took it from her before it spilled. I reached the podium, tapped the microphone once, and the room fell silent in an instant. "Thank you, Mr. Secretary," I said, my voice clear and steady. "Tonight, I want to talk about something most people never think about: the nature of information. Because the most dangerous threat we face isn't always the one you can see coming. Sometimes it's the one you've spent years underestimating, simply because it doesn't look the way you expect its strength to look." I let my gaze drift, briefly, across the crowd, and land, just for a second, on my family's table. For most of my career, my work has been invisible by design. That's the nature of intelligence. The better you do your job, the less anyone knows you did it. I used to think that meant the work didn't matter to the people closest to me. I've learned, over time, that invisibility and insignificance are not the same thing. What we do in the dark, quietly, without applause, is very often the thing standing between the people we love and the dangers they'll never have to face. There's a lesson in that, I think, that extends well beyond intelligence work. We all know people who measure worth only by what can be photographed, framed, and hung on a wall. A title on a business card. A number on a bonus check. I understand that impulse. It's human, and it's simple, and simple things are comforting. But some of the most important work any of us will ever do happens exactly where no one is looking, and it deserves to be believed in anyway, on faith, by the people who claim to love us. I'm grateful tonight to every person in this room who has ever done exactly that, for me and for each other. Thank you. I finished to a wave of applause that felt entirely different from the first, sustained, resonant, the sound of a room that understood exactly what had just been said and why. I stepped down from the podium with my new stars catching the light, and for just a moment before the crowd closed in around me, I let myself feel the whole shape of it. Not triumph exactly, but something steadier. A revel. Afterward, I was surrounded, not by family, but by the people who spoke my language. A senator gripped my hand. "Extraordinary speech, Admiral." "Extraordinary speech, Admiral." "Extraordinary." A 4-star general I'd worked alongside on a joint task force clapped my shoulder. "Renee, that SIGINT framework you built needs to go Pacific-wide. We should talk this week." This was the room where my work was understood, where the thing my family called a computer game was recognized as the architecture of national security. Across the room, my family sat in a small, silent island of stillness while the party celebrated around them. No one approached their table. Not out of cruelty, simply because, in that room, they were 3 civilians nobody there had reason to know. I watched Lieutenant Commander Naomi Okafor cross the floor toward them, her posture perfectly correct, her expression professionally warm. "Mr. Holt, Mr. Holt, Miss Cole," she said. "The Admiral asked me to let you know your car is ready whenever you'd like it. The public portion of the evening is wrapping up shortly." There was no malice in the words, just procedure, but I understood, watching from across the room, exactly what my family heard underneath them. They stood. My father's movements were slow, almost careful, like a man walking through a room he suddenly realized he didn't understand as well as he thought he did. He looked back once toward the crowd still gathered around me, and I saw him mouth something to himself. I couldn't hear it, but I would swear to this day that it was my rank. Tried out silently on his tongue like a word in a foreign language he was only now learning to pronounce. Vanessa was pale, her earlier bravado nowhere in sight. not because she felt remorse, I would learn later, but because she'd already begun calculating how fast this story would travel through her firm. How many of her colleagues had connections in this room, how thoroughly the ground beneath her carefully built reputation had just shifted under her heels. Her friend from the ballroom, the one she'd been gossiping to about my Facebook job, wouldn't meet her eyes on the way out. They almost made it to the door without me. I broke away from the cluster of well-wishers around me. A small, deliberate choice, the last one I'd make that night that had anything to do with them, and caught up to my father just inside the lobby, where the noise of the ballroom fell away into marble quiet. "Dad!" He turned, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Up close, away from the crowd, he looked older than he had at the barbecue 2 weeks earlier. Or maybe I was only now letting myself see him clearly. Renee. He cleared his throat again, like the word itself had caught somewhere on the way out. I don't really know what to say to you right now. You don't have to say anything tonight, I said. I just wanted to say good night. Vice Admiral, he said, testing the word slowly, like a phrase in a language he'd only just started learning. 3 stars. Renee, I had no idea. I knew you'd made rank, I just never. He stopped, shook his head. I never asked what it meant, did I? In all these years, I don't think I ever once asked you what any of it actually meant. No, I said gently, without cruelty in it. You didn't. He nodded, absorbing that the way a man absorbs a diagnosis, slow and careful, bracing against the next word. I'm sorry, he said. That's not enough. I know it's not enough, but I am. I know, I said. Get home safe, Dad. We'll talk soon. I didn't offer him more than that, not that night. It wasn't coldness. It was simply the truth. That some repairs take longer than a single conversation in a marble lobby, and that I wasn't willing to hand over in one rushed exchange everything it had taken me 27 years to build for myself. He nodded, understanding that too in his own way, and turned to follow Derek and Vanessa out into the dark. I watched them go from across the lobby, 3 familiar backs moving toward the door, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, something other than the old ache of being unseen. I felt simply, quietly done waiting for them to look. And underneath that, something smaller and more fragile, something almost like hope. The sense that a door, once it's finally been opened, even a crack, doesn't necessarily have to close again. My office was in the E-ring of the Pentagon now, the nameplate on the door simple and final, Vadim R. Holt, Deputy Director, Naval Information Warfare. The doctrine born in that windowless skiff was now standard across the fleet. My mornings were briefings with the CNO, my afternoons were spent with a team of the sharpest, strangest, most brilliantly stubborn people I'd ever worked with, my real family in every way that counted. People who challenged me and respected me in equal measure, who never once needed my job explained to them twice. Some mornings walking the long corridor toward my office past the wall of stars and the portraits of officers who'd worn this same rank before me, I still caught myself waiting for the old ache to show up, the one that used to arrive right on schedule every time someone asked what I did for a living. It never quite did anymore, not because the past had disappeared, but because it had finally stopped being the loudest voice in the room. Derek and Vanessa's engagement had ended 3 weeks after the gala. I heard about it the way you hear about most family news now, secondhand, through my mother's cousin, who heard it from someone at the club. Vanessa apparently couldn't stand the way people at the firm now looked at her. The woman who'd spent 2 years publicly mocking a vice admiral's career to her face, in a city where half the senior partners had military contacts of their own. Derek, for his part, sent me a short, awkward text a month later. Hope you're doing well, Admiral. Been thinking about a lot lately. I hadn't replied yet. Some doors, I was learning, could be left ajar without needing to be walked through right away. My father's email arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing fleet readiness data. The subject line was just my name. Catherine, Renee. I had no idea what you've done. What they said about you at that dinner. I'm proud. I don't know what else to say. Can we talk? 10 years ago, that email would have undone me completely. It would have been the validation I'd rehearsed receiving 1,000 times in my head on drives home from disappointing holidays, in the quiet after other people's toasts. I read it now and felt something quieter, not triumph, not the cold, nothing I might have expected either, something more like recognition. The recognition that my sense of worth no longer lived in his hands and hadn't for a long time, but that the door between us wasn't necessarily closed forever either. I sat with the cursor blinking for a long moment, my coffee going lukewarm beside my keyboard. 10 years ago, I would have called him back within the hour, hungry for every word of that apology, ready to hand him the keys to a peace I'd been quietly begging for since I was 15. 5 years ago, I might have deleted it without answering at all and told myself that was strength. Neither version felt true anymore. I thought about Callahan's words. Don't let their smallness make you small too. And then underneath it, quieter, I thought about something else he'd said the night before the gala. That the recognition was real and earned, and that I should let myself feel every second of it. But that it was never meant to be the thing my worth depended on. I understood, finally, sitting there with my father's email open in front of me, that forgiveness and dependency were two different things entirely. I could open the door a few inches without handing him the keys again. I typed a reply shorter than his email and didn't overthink it. Dad, thank you for saying that. It means something. I'm not ready to talk about everything yet, and that's okay. But I'd be glad to have coffee sometime if you want to actually ask me what I do. I'll even try to explain it in plain English this time. I hit send before I could second guess it and felt lighter than I expected to. Later that week, Priya Anand knocked on my office door, practically vibrating. Ma'am? I got it. The Cyber Fellowship. They picked me. Priya, that's incredible. Out of how many applicants? 200 for 6 spots. She was grinning so wide it looked like it hurt, clutching the acceptance letter in both hands like it might blow away. I still can't believe it. I kept refreshing my email like it was going to change. You earned every bit of it, I said. Your analysis on the network anomaly last spring, the one you almost didn't submit because you weren't sure you were right? That was the sharpest read anyone on my team produced that quarter. You've had this in you the whole time. My dad still doesn't really get it, she said, a little quieter now. But I called him anyway. I told him what it means. Actually told him, this time, instead of just letting him assume it was nothing or letting the silence do the explaining for me. How'd that go? He asked a lot of questions. She laughed, a little disbelieving, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand, dumb ones mostly. Whether I'd get to carry a gun, whether it was dangerous. But he asked, that's more than he's done in 4 years. Sorry, I don't know why I'm getting emotional about this. Don't apologize for that, I said. Not in this office. Not ever. She nodded, collected herself, and headed for the door, then paused. Ma'am, can I ask you something? Do you think he'll ever really understand what I do? I thought about my own father's email still open in a browser tab 3 feet from where I sat and about all the years before it, and about the shape of a question I'd asked myself in exactly those words more times than I could count. Maybe not completely, I said, but understanding isn't the only thing worth asking for. Sometimes it's enough that they finally start asking the questions instead of assuming they already know the answers. The rest can come later, or it cannot come at all, and you'll still be exactly who you were always going to become. Priya smiled, small and real, and closed the door behind her. I sat alone for a moment in the quiet of my office, the hum of the building settling around me the way it did every evening around this hour. Somewhere down the hall, a printer clicked through its cycle. Somewhere beyond that, in a windowless room, not unlike the one where this whole story had truly begun, someone else's Naomi was walking into someone else's office without knocking, carrying news that would matter to people who would never know her name. I thought about the legacy of 27 years and understood finally that it was never going to be measured by whether my father fully grasped the SCIF or the doctrine or the third star on my shoulder. It was measured in rooms like this one, in the quiet moment before a young officer walked out taller than she'd walked in, carrying a little more belief in herself than she'd arrived with. My family had spent my whole life trying to fit me into a box small enough for them to understand. For a long time, I let them because it was easier than the alternative, because peace, even a false, cramped peace, can feel safer than the work of insisting on your own size. But the ocean was never meant to fit in a box. And somewhere along the way, without ever raising my voice, without a single confrontation, without asking anyone's permission, I had stopped needing them to understand the depth of it. I only needed to know it myself. That, it turns out, had been enough all along. I straightened the nameplate on my door, picked up my next briefing folder, and walked down the E-ring corridor toward whatever came next, not as the quiet daughter who'd peaked in high school, and not as a woman defined by anyone's applause or anyone's silence, but simply as myself, Vice Admiral Renee Holt, finally, fully, on my own terms. Outside, the Pentagon's endless corridors stretched in every direction, full of people carrying their own invisible weight, their own quiet expertise nobody at their family dinner table would ever fully understand. I thought about my father's email still sitting unanswered in a folder I hadn't decided what to do with yet, and about the coffee I'd offered him, and about how strange it was that the biggest reconciliation of my life might end up happening not in a ballroom full of applause, but across a small table with 2 cups going cold between us. No stars on my shoulder, no audience at all. Just a father finally asking his daughter the questions he should have asked 30 years ago, and a daughter deciding for the first time that she was willing to answer them. Some stories end with a single explosive moment of vindication, and if you only remember one part of mine, let it be that ballroom, the stunned silence, the standing ovation. The look on my father's face when 3 decades of assumptions finally cracked open in real time. But the truer ending, the one that actually mattered, happened quietly, months later, in ordinary rooms, with no spotlight at all. A fellowship acceptance letter clutched in the young analyst's shaking hands, a short email answered honestly instead of ignored. A door left open a crack instead of slammed shut for good. That's where the real work of a life gets done, not in the moment everyone finally sees you, but in everything you build afterward, once you've stopped needing them to. If you've ever had your life's work dismissed by people who were supposed to be in your corner, tell us your story in the comments. In this community, we salute your rank.